In this video, I'll teach you absolutely everything there is to know about using custom events inside of Bubble. If you're looking to take your Bubble skills to the next level, this is the tutorial for you. Throughout this guide, I'm going to start by explaining what on earth custom events are, and then go on to elaborate when and why you should use them. Using real-world examples, I'll walk through the step-by-step instructions you need to follow when creating and editing your own custom events. Look, I've already rambled on for long enough. Let's open up our Bubble editor and we can get started. Before I even open up my Bubble editor and consider showing you anything that we're going to build today, the first thing I'd like to do is just take some time to talk about the main benefits of using custom events over traditional workflows. And the reason I'm doing this is because if you're anything like me, you're probably wondering why on earth you should even care about custom events in the first place. At this point in your Bubble journey, I'm sure you're more than capable of just creating standard workflows. And look, that's enough to be dangerous inside of Bubble. But I'm sure you've probably heard on the Bubble forum or on places like Twitter or X, people mentioning about how powerful custom events are. And look, you're obviously interested. That's why you're watching this video. Look, custom events are going to save you so much time and headache inside of Bubble. The best way to describe custom events is that they're just like reusable elements for workflows. Now, I remember when I started using Bubble, I never really cared too much about reusable elements, but it's one of those things where once you open the door, you can't go back through it. In Bubble, the idea of a reusable element is that instead of having to recreate the exact same element multiple times across multiple different sections in your app, you can just create one reusable element and reference that whenever you want to display that exact same element. And look, that's the exact same thing with custom events. Custom events are just a fancy way of saying reusable workflows, in my opinion. With a reusable workflow, you can build out the workflow and all the steps involved in it just once, and then instead of having to recreate that exact same workflow whenever you want to use a similar piece of logic, you can just reference your one existing custom event. So that way you don't have to build it from scratch time and time again. Now, the other big benefit to this being something like a reusable workflow is that when you make changes to that one existing reusable workflow, those changes will automatically be applied to anywhere else on your page that references that exact workflow. Now, today I'm going to show you a great example of this where I want to send an email to a customer once an event has occurred. And if at some point in time I wanted to change, let's say, the subject line of that email, if I had two separate versions of the same workflow, I'd have to go to each individual workflow and update the subject line. Whereas with a custom event or a reusable workflow, you only have to change it once and those changes will automatically be applied across everywhere inside of your app. Now, the other main benefit to using a custom event is that it just allows you to clean up your workflow structure. So as you start to build out a whole bunch of workflows on your page, things are going to start to get a little messy. And so the purpose of creating custom events is that if you're going to be reusing workflows, it's just going to reduce the total amount of workflows that you actually need to add onto your page. And so whenever you go into your workflow editor then, it's not going to look like a whole bunch of spaghetti. Things are going to be much more structured and it's going to be easier to manage in the long run. Now finally, the other key benefit is something more on the technical side of things, and this is definitely something I'm going to show you in a moment. But custom events allow you to actually customize the order of operations or execution within a workflow. So not many people actually know this, but inside of Bubble, let's say you got a workflow with 5 different steps. When that workflow runs, I'm sure you'd probably think that it runs step by step in that order. Look, that is not the case. Bubble runs all of those workflow steps at the exact same time, so in parallel. And look, that can get quite problematic if you want a step to run after an existing step. And so this is the other beautiful thing about custom events. When you add a custom event inside of your workflow, all of the steps after the custom event step will wait until the custom event is finished. So it just gives you more control over how you can actually execute all of the steps within your workflows. Now look, by this point, I feel like I've done enough rambling on. What I'm really excited to do is jump into our Bubble editor so that way I can actually show you how to create a custom event from scratch. And look, I assure you the whole process is much easier than you would expect. So let's jump over into my Bubble editor here. And as you can see, I've created a small demo page for our tutorial today. Now within this section of my app, I've just created a user profile page. So if I was to double click on this page here, what you'll see is that I have a type of content set as a user, which just means that on this page, I'm going to be displaying a user's profile. Now, as you can see, this page is also broken down into 2 separate sections. On the left-hand side, we're just displaying the user's details, as well as a follow button. And then on the right-hand side, I have a repeating group here, which just displays a list of posts that are created by the person's profile that we're viewing. And inside of each post, I just have the details about the user, a heading, an image, and the actual caption of the post. But of course, what you'll also see is that I have another follow button here. So let's say you're using my app and you land on someone's profile page and you want to follow this user. Right now, you have the option to select from both of these follow buttons. Now, although these two buttons are separate, they're going to do the exact same thing. So if I was to double click on my first follow button here, you'll notice I've called this my button follow main because this is the main follow button on my page. And when I choose to edit this workflow here, what I've done is I've just created a simple workflow with 2 steps inside of it. Now within these 2 steps, I've just created a pretty basic workflow where we're just adding someone to a list of followers and then adding another person to a list of people following someone. So if I quickly just digress and open up my data tab here, under my user data type, you'll see I have 2 fields. There's the followers, which is a list of users. So if you were visiting someone's profile and you selected to follow them, I'm going to add you into this list of followers. But at the same time, I'm also going to update your list of people that you're following. And I'm going to add the person whose profile you've just followed to your list. So that's what I've done in these 2 steps here. In my first step, I'm adding you to the list of followers. And then in the second step, I'm adding the person whose profile you're viewing to the list of people that you're following. And so that's how I built out my first workflow here. And within my second workflow, on my button follow feed, because this is the follow button that sits inside of my feed of posts, when I edit this workflow here, it's going to open up our other existing workflow, which is the exact same thing. So it has the same 2 steps. Now within our example today, what I'd like to do is add an additional step to our workflows where once someone has followed a user, I want to send an email to the person who received that follow, just so we can let them know they have a new follower. And so what we're going to have to do is create the exact same workflow step across both of our separate workflows here, which as you'll see in a moment is going to be quite time consuming. So let's say within this workflow, when the button follow in the feed is clicked, after we follow the users, I'm going to add an additional step. I'm going to head down to my email actions and choose the send email event. Now the person I'd like to send this email to is going to be the current page user, because this is the person whose profile you're viewing and you've just followed. So I'm going to reference the current page's user, their email. Then for the sender name, I'm just going to call this test app. And for the subject, I'm going to say you have a new follower. And then I'm quickly just going to write a message here. I'm going to say, hey, and I'm going to add in their name. So I will insert dynamic data and reference the current page's user, their name. I'll then add a comma and say, you just received a new follower. I'll add a full stop and say, their name is... And then I will insert dynamic data and I'm going to add your name. So if you've just followed someone, I want your name to appear in this email. So you would be the current user because you're currently viewing the page of the profile. So I'm just going to add the current user, their name. And look, I'll just add a full stop. Now, of course, this is probably how you've traditionally built out workflows in the past. I'm sure you're more than familiar with adding individual steps within the same workflow. But now what you'll find we have to do is actually replicate this exact same step within our additional workflow here. Now, of course, you could build this from scratch, but of course you can copy and paste workflows across. So when I right click on this, I can select on my additional workflow and paste this in. Now, although this might seem like it didn't take too long to do, believe me, there's a much faster and easier way to do this, and that is by using custom events. And one of the other main reasons why I do this is, let's say I want to change the subject line. If I wanted to add an emoji within my subject line here, let's say I just want to put the fire emoji in, I then have to go back to my existing workflow and do the exact same thing. And look, there's no guaranteeing that I'm going to do this in the exact same way. As the admin of my app, I could accidentally add a fire emoji in without the space. So there's no way of ensuring that these are consistent, and obviously it's going to be a pain in the absolute butt to have to change this if you're referencing this exact same workflow multiple times throughout your app. And so this is where we're going to create our first custom event. Instead of having to add all of these individual steps within the same workflow twice, what I'm going to do is create one custom workflow that's going to run this chain of events. And then any single time a follow button is clicked, what I'm going to do is just reference that custom workflow. It's truly as simple as that. So in order to create a custom event, what we need to do is create a brand new workflow from scratch. And if you scroll down to the bottom, I'm sure this is unfamiliar territory. What we're going to do here is just create a new custom event. And the only thing we need to worry about right now is giving this custom event a name. And so I'm going to call this the follow sequence. So within this custom event, I've just got a sequence of workflows which are going to allow us to follow a user. Now, by all means, you can call this custom event whatever you would like. It's up to your discretion. Now, after giving your event a name, you can just go on to build out your custom event the exact same way you would for any other workflow. And so that's why I prefer to call these reusable workflows. In my opinion, the word custom event sounds scary. It almost seems like we have too much control because things are custom and that we might break things. And look, that's not the case at all. And look, instead of rebuilding this workflow from scratch, what I'm going to do is just copy across the existing workflow steps that I just want to replicate. So within my follow button here, I'm going to select on the first step, I'm going to right click, I'll copy this, I'll jump over into my new custom event, which is my follow sequence. I'll right click and paste that in. I'll do the exact same thing for my 2 additional steps here. So I'll just jump back and grab the last step where we're sending an email. I'll paste that in. And just like that, we now have our very own custom event or reusable workflow. Now I hope you're ready because this is my favorite part. When we open up our existing workflows from our follow buttons, I'm looking at this and I'm just seeing a whole bunch of bloat that we don't need anymore. Let's delete all of these 3 steps here. That's right, I'm absolutely ruthless. Because instead of having 3 steps, all I'm gonna do is scroll on down to my custom events here and I'm gonna trigger a custom event. And look, by default, I only have 1 custom event on this page, so it's automatically selected that. And that custom event is, of course, my follow sequence. And I bet right now you're thinking, Lachlan, what about all the additional steps I need to add into my workflow? Well, that's where I'm going to hold you right up because that is all we need to add inside of this workflow here. It's done. You can dust your hands off because it was truly that easy. Right now, whenever this follow button is clicked, it's automatically going to trigger a custom event. So this workflow here is going to zap over to our custom event and these steps are going to run. And now we can do the exact same thing for our other follow button. So we're going to click on our first workflow here. I'm going to delete all of these steps once again, and I'm just going to add 1 workflow step, which if I head to my custom events, I'm going to trigger a custom event and it will be my follow sequence. And look, we're not even done at this point. I'm yet to show you the best part. And look, I apologize if I seem too excited about this, but these little things in Bubble really get me going. What we're going to do now is jump over to our custom event and open up step 3 where I'm sending an email. Now, let's say if I want to change the copy of this email. So in my app, I've done a whole bunch of user testing and everyone's gotten back to me with the same feedback. They say, Lachlan, you don't quite have product market fit. And the reason for that is because you're using a fire emoji instead of a party popper emoji. If you change this, I'll definitely use your app for the rest of my life. And so look, I as the founder have no other choice but to listen to what the people want. So for my subject line here, I'm going to get rid of the fire emoji and I'm going to add a party popper emoji. And now because I've changed this within my custom event or my reusable workflow, now whenever the follow button is clicked and it triggers my custom event, it of course is going to send the email with the party popper in the subject line. And so I only had to change the subject line in 1 workflow. I didn't have to change the email in both of these workflows, and that is because they are referencing the same custom event. Now at this point, that concludes about 80% of everything you need to know about custom events. So if you feel like you've got what you needed to learn, bon voyage, it's been fantastic. But if you want to learn about the other 20%, which is going to take your custom events to the next level, I'd recommend hearing me out. So today within my example, I replaced all of my workflow steps and put them in 1 custom event. But one thing I want to highlight is that you don't need to follow this exact same process. And what I mean by that is you don't need to put all of your workflow steps in the 1 custom event. What you could do is actually only put 1 step in this. And so what do I mean by that? Let's say if I was to open up my existing follow button workflow here. And for the sake of our tutorial today, let's imagine that I only want to put step 3 here, which is where I'm sending my email within a custom event. And so why would I want to do that? Let's say that between these 2 workflows, not everything is going to be identical. There might only be 1 step in the workflow that's going to reference a similar thing that already exists. And that thing is of course going to be sending an email to a user. What I can actually do is jump back to my follow button workflow, and I'm just going to quickly delete my custom event. Then what I'm going to do is add in my additional 2 steps that already existed inside of this workflow. So I'm just going to quickly copy these back over. Now after these steps run, what I could actually do is trigger a custom event from here. So if I added an additional step, I could head to my custom events, trigger a custom event, and that custom event is of course my follow sequence. But if I only wanted to send an email within this custom event, I'm free to do that. I can delete these first 2 steps, and if I really wanted, I could even update the event name. I'm going to call this follow email send because of course we're sending an email within this custom event whenever someone was followed. And so now what's going to happen within our workflow is that these two steps are going to run, and then it's going to send my email within my custom event. So to my point, you don't need to put everything inside of a custom event. You can even just add one step. And the reason you do that is because if you have one step that you're referencing time and time again across a bunch of different workflows, you can just tuck that into a custom event or a reusable workflow. And it's just going to save you from rebuilding that exact same workflow from scratch every single time. Now, something else that's really important to know about custom events is the way in which all of these steps in our workflow are going to run. Now, I mentioned this at the start of our tutorial today, but a lot of people don't actually know that when a workflow runs, all of these steps don't really run in order. Bubble just automatically runs all of these at the exact same time. So I remember when I first started using Bubble, I thought step 1 would run. Once that's finished, step 2 would run. Once that's finished, step 3 would run, and so on. And as I just mentioned, that is not the case. Step 1, 2, and 3 will all run at the exact same time, except if you have a custom event. So let's say if I was to move my custom event trigger into step 2 right now. The way Bubble treats workflows that have a custom event is that it's going to trigger all of the steps before the custom event. Then once Bubble gets to our custom event here, it's going to journey off and run this workflow. So all of the steps within this custom event are then going to run. And then once all of those steps are complete, Bubble's then going to return to our main workflow and run all of the steps after that custom event. And so custom events are just a great way of also breaking workflows down into a particular order. They just give you more control over the order of execution. And at this point in time, you're starting to get pretty dangerous with everything you know about custom events. But the final thing I'm about to show you is going to completely change how you work inside of Bubble. So if you're working in Bubble and you're creating workflow steps, you might know that it's possible to reference data from previous steps. And so what do I mean by that? Let's say if I was to delete all of the steps within this workflow here, and let's say for an example, I just want to create a new thing in step 1, and that thing is going to be a new post. And then in step 2 of my workflow, I'm just going to make changes to a thing. The thing will be the current user, and I'm just going to update their bio. What I could do is reference the result of step 1 in our workflow and pull data from the post that was created. And so this was always the beautiful thing about creating standard workflows. You have the ability for all of these steps to talk to each other. But when it comes to custom events, because they live off in their own little world, we actually can't reference data from step 1 or step 2 within our workflow. And look, that's a pretty important thing you need to be able to do, particularly if I'm sending an email here. Look, today within my example, I was fortunate enough to be able to store the data of a user in our page. But let's say I didn't have that information and I needed to grab the email address of the person who's just been followed. How on earth could I do that? Especially if my custom event is separate from my main workflow here. Thankfully, Bubble's already 2 steps ahead of us, and they've created a feature which allows us to send parameters inside of a custom event trigger. Now, I'm sure the last 5 words I said are complete jargon to you, particularly if you are relatively new to Bubble. So don't worry, your boy's got you. I'm about to explain it in plain English. In Bubble, a parameter is just a fancy way of saying that you're going to send data to something. So let's say if I open up my custom event here, where I'm sending an email, I'm just going to clear all of this data where I'm sending the email to someone. And let's say I want to reference an email from my initial workflow here, so I can store that within my to field here. What I can do is actually select on the custom event itself, and you'll see this option to add a parameter. Now, if you've ever used URL parameters or page parameters inside of Bubble, this is the exact same thing. And if you haven't, don't stress, because it's super straightforward. What I'd like to do is actually create a way to send some data of an email address to my custom event. So I'm going to create what's known as a new parameter, which as I said is a bit of information. And look, today, instead of sending the email address, I'm going to send through the actual user who I should contact. So for the piece of data I'm sending through, I'm just going to first of all need to give this a name. So you can call this whatever you want. I'm just going to say that this is the followed user. So when someone is followed within my first workflow step, I'd just like to identify who the person is that receives that follow. Then I'm going to send the data of that particular user to my custom event from which I can reference their email field. Now, after giving my parameter a name, I just need to reference what type of data I'm going to be sending through. And as I mentioned, in this case, I want to send through the data of a user. Now, as you'll see, there's a couple of different options you can check here if you want. You can make this a list. So if you want to send through a list of users, you could do that. In my case, I don't need to today. I just want it to be one user. And look, you can also tick this box to make this parameter optional, but for me, I want to make it mandatory. So I'm going to leave this unchecked. Now, if I was to jump into my existing workflow here, what I'm going to do is add an additional step where I'm triggering a custom event. And as you'll now see, when I run my custom event, which is my follow send email, I'm now required to send through some data in my own parameter, which I called followed user. And so because the type of data stored within this parameter was a user, I'm required to send through the information of a specific user, which today I'm just going to reference the current page user. So that is the person whose profile we're viewing and we've just selected to follow. So I'm just going to reference that. Then whenever this workflow runs here, my first workflow is going to send through the data of that specific user to my custom event, which then means within my workflow step, under my to field, so this is where we're sending this email to, I can insert dynamic data, and now you'll see the option to reference the data sent within our parameter. So once again, my parameter was called followed user, and it was storing the value of one specific user. So I'm going to reference the followed user, and of course, because this is a user, I can reference all of the data fields that sit under our user data type, and the email is one of those. And just like that, that is how we can send data to our own custom event. And look, if you select on the custom event trigger, as you'll see, you have the option to add as many parameters as you would like. So your options aren't just limited to sending one piece of information. If you need to send multiple bits of information, you can do just that. Now, there are talks right now to be able to eventually send data back from your custom event, but nothing tangible has come out yet in terms of that feature. But look, in the future, watch this space because I imagine it won't be long before you can actually get a value from your custom event and send it back through to your main workflow and vice versa. So both your initial workflow and your custom event will be able to talk to each other in perfect harmony. But look, at this point, your boy has rambled on for so damn long, but I truly hope this was a masterclass when it came to working with custom events. I really wanted to leave no stone unturned. But from here, you've just leveled up inside of Bubble, and now it's time to start getting dangerous by creating your own custom events. And just like that, you now know how to utilize custom events inside of Bubble. As you can see, once you're able to understand a few core concepts, the possibilities truly are endless. If you found this video useful, I'd always recommend hitting that subscribe button on my channel, so that way you can be the first to know whenever I drop a new Bubble tutorial. In the meantime, I just wanted to say a massive thank you for taking the time to watch this specific video, and I wish you all of the best on your own no-code journey.